Okay, so we're going to at least talk a little bit about the Pacific Theater when it comes to World War II. A lot of these events have some impact on the European events, and a lot of these events were participated in, at least by the Allied forces and the British and whatnot. Um, so it's not nearly as important as the European and North African theaters, but um, we'll get into it a little bit. The first thing you need to know is that Japan had started its conquest of other Asian countries as early as 1910. So obviously that's not World War II, but obviously it starts to show the picture of Japan kind of going off of its island and going out and capturing territory that they believe is going to be useful to them, or capturing territory from races and cultures that they think are inferior to them, at least at some point. So in 1910, they took Korea. There's a very kind of old hatred between the Japanese and the Koreans, at least going back quite a few centuries. And so when the Japanese took Korea, obviously a slap in the face to Koreans, but obviously kind of showed where the Japanese mindset was in the early 1900s and continued right into World War II. In 1931, the Japanese took Manchuria. Manchuria was kind of a disputed territory at that point. The Russians had laid claim to it. The Chinese had laid claim to it. There's a lot of people who wanted Manchuria to be its own nation. And the Japanese kind of took advantage of this disputed territory and, the chaos, and went in and took Manchuria in 1931. Manchuria was crucial to the Japanese because Manchuria is a very valuable farmland in Asia, and the Japanese have limited resources when it comes to food. There's 110 million people living on the islands of Japan, and it's limited territory, and so to capture Manchuria sort of allowed them to believe that they could feed their own people if necessary. In 1937, the Japanese basically declared war on China and went deeper and deeper into China. And their campaign against the Chinese was brutal, very similar to the Nazi campaigns in Europe. They treated the Chinese people with disdain, and if the Chinese army retreated, oftentimes the people were punished for the sins of the army. Nanking is probably the most brutal of the battles that's been pretty well documented. And, the Japanese still are kind of living with the legacy of what they did in China, in the sense of how they treated the enemy combatants, but also how they treated the civilians. And, even recently, there's still a lot of stories coming out about the way they interned Chinese women to kind of be sexual, slaves to the army as they were proceeding deeper and deeper into China. So there's a lot of unsavory details to the Japanese occupation of China. And, the stories really aren't any nicer than the stories that are told about the Nazis as they went through Europe. In 1940, Japan took Indochina, was the name of it at that time. It's also called Southeast Asia. And Indochina at that point was a territory of France. So in a sense, the European powers are drawn into this in 1940. Now, France was fighting for its own life in 1940 against the Germans, and from the European theater notes that the Germans were able to take over France in 40 days. So seeing that France was in such a desperate situation in Europe, the Japanese took advantage of that desperate situation and took over the French territories in Southeast Asia. The three countries we know this territory as today are Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And again, the Japanese, treated the people of this territory as, poorly, and there are numerous documentations on how the folks who lived in Southeast Asia were mistreated by the Japanese. Um, in 1941, late 1941, so December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Um, U.S. So obvious, well, not obviously, but at the time, Hawaii was not a state in the United States. It was a territory of the United States, but there was a huge American naval base on Pearl Harbor. Um, and the idea was that the Japanese would take out the U.S. naval base on Pearl Harbor. They would blow up the Panama Canal, and then it would take months and months and months, they knew, for the U.S. Navy to kind of reorganize itself and be able to mount an offensive against the Japanese. The idea was that if the Japanese could kind of get rid of the U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor and delay the U.S. forces from kind of supporting that attack, then the Japanese could set up an Asian empire without U.S. interference. So in a lot of ways, the Japanese had planned it out pretty well. They realized that the European powers were enmeshed in their own war. They realized the United States was 6,000 miles away. If they could get rid of the U.S. forces in Hawaii, which were closer, obviously, than 6,000 miles to Japan. So the idea was that if they could eliminate the United States from the equation, they could kind of really lock down and set up an Asian empire with the Pacific Islands as their buffer zone. They had already gotten Korea and Southeast Asia. They had already stabbed pretty deeply into China. So things were looking pretty good for Japan in late 1941, early 1942. By 1942, the Japanese also took the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Wake, Guam, the Aleutian Islands, a couple of the Aleutian Islands, the Philippines. And the Philippines was another big island that had a lot of people and a lot of resources. And the Philippines was a U.S. territory at that time. The Philippines had become a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And so this is the first, the Aleutian Islands and the Philippines and Guam were some of the big American territories that the Japanese were able to take away from America in 1942. One of the benefits of taking all these territories was, number one, it added to the buffer zone between the Japanese and the Americans. But number two, it allowed the Japanese to control the world market on rubber. And I know it doesn't sound like much, but controlling the world market on rubber at the time was a big deal because rubber was necessary for Jeep tires and plane tires and whatnot. And even to this day, we've developed some synthetic rubbers, but rubber is still the most durable kind of best product to make all of these kind of flexible, strong materials like tires and whatnot out of. So that was a big hit to the U.S. And if you ask your great-great-grandparents now or great-grandparents or whomever, you couldn't buy tires during World War II because all the rubber was so vital to the U.S. Military enterprise that was going on. The last thing on 1942 was the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was fought off of Midway Island, which is about halfway across the Pacific Ocean. And it was a battle between the Japanese aircraft carriers and the U.S. aircraft carriers. I don't know, but everything I've heard is that the strategies between the two countries weren't that differing, in that there was a lot of luck involved. But at the end of the day, the U.S. was able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and the Japanese were able to only take out 1 U.S. aircraft carrier. After that, the U.S. had an advantage in the Pacific because it takes a long, long time to build aircraft carriers. And if you have the only functioning aircraft carriers in the Pacific, you basically have floating islands from which you can launch attacks. So it was a big advantage And it was the real turning point in the Pacific theater when the U.S. was able to kind of take out so much of the Japanese firepower, especially in aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway. And from then on out, it was kind of a battle of attrition towards Japan for the United States. And we'll talk about that next time.